Now, let's get ready for our next panel. Captain Steve Curry has invited a great set of panelists from across the aviation industry to discuss several initiatives that ALPA and the industry have taken to promote more secure flight operations. I'd now like to ask Captain Curry and his panelists to make their way to the stage.
Hello everyone, my name is Steve Curry. I'm a United 767 captain in Houston. I serve as the United MEC Security Chair and also for ALPA National, the law enforcement liaison. Got a good panel here. We thank everyone for joining us. This discussion is strengthening our stance on aviation security. So to begin with, we just start with an introduction on yourself and your background and what your area of expertise is.
Hey, afternoon or early evening, everybody. My name is John Muth. I'm an acting assistant administrator within the Air Marshal Service. Right now, I'm overseeing flight operations, which kind of has two parts to it. On one side, it's the operational side, where the big dog is the Transportation Security Operations Center, or the TSOC, most of you probably know of. Also have the SOC-S, which is the unit that handles our Air Marshal's mission reservation and planning, as well as our information coordination section, which does our special mission coverage. Then on the program side, we have liaison, which is both our liaison with foreign countries as well as with airlines. We have our vulnerability assessment folks, we have our UAS folks, our counter manpads, and a growing area insider threat. So happy to be here. My day job, I'm a regional director in field operations, so I oversee our 10 offices out on the West Coast and down south. And I oversee the Viper program, which is something I'm sure we'll discuss a lot here today. Thanks.
Great, thank you, John. Jason.
Afternoon, Steve. Yeah, hi, Jason Wallace. I'm the Chief of Police for the Port of Portland, the recent president of the Airport Law Enforcement Association Network, Agency Network, where I was term limited out. And that background has given me kind of a baseline pulse of what you all experience when you land or divert to different airports, and you get kind of a varied response from the locals. So I've worked on that, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to talk to you offline. Also on the Aviation Security Advisory Committee with Wolfgang, and I think my first experience with ALPA was last spring, conference here, but work with all the different agencies here at on the stage, and nice to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Dan.
Good afternoon. Happy to be here. My name is Dan Markley. I'm a special agent in the FBI. I've been in the intelligence community and the law enforcement community for about 20 years now. My career started with the National Nuclear Security Administration. That's the agency under Department of Energy that makes the nation's nuclear warheads and cleans up loose nuclear material around the world. Eventually, I pivoted over to the FBI. And my most recent position there is the airport liaison agent at Dulles Airport. So our team across Dulles and Reagan Airport is 11 federal agents strong. And in these past 5 years, I've learned a heck of a lot about the aviation industry and just how hard your jobs are. And I look forward to learning even more, even here today on the panel.
Great, Dan, thank you. Darren?
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Darren Dorn. I'm an Anchorage-based captain with Alaska Airlines. Been involved in the aviation sector since shortly after 9/11. I got hired by Alaska Airlines just prior to 9/11, so you can imagine that impact as a young first officer had on me. Prior to my work in the aviation security side, I spent 20 plus years active duty in the U.S. Army, senior non-commissioned officer, warrant officer, commissioned officer, and special operations in aviation.
Outstanding. Welcome all. Thank you for being here. And it's great to have this wide, breadth of knowledge within the aviation security as we kind of continue to try to improve and adjust to the developing threats within the aviation ecosystem. So for our audience, let's establish a baseline of why we need to continue strengthening aviation security. And, with broad representation from all of our government partners and other agencies, it's good to hear an opportunity to hear the perspective of what the current threat environment is and maybe how it's evolved. So John, maybe you can start us off.
Yeah, I joined the Air Marshal Service in May of 2002, so shortly after 9/11, and it's funny because I was thinking yesterday about how far we've come, where the threat is, and as an agency, both within Air Marshal Service and the larger TSA, where our focus has evolved. Right after 9/11, it was Al-Qaeda, 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 right? And it was all about, for us, the Air Marshals, it was all about not allowing a plane to be turned into a missile again. And we were seeing ghosts. There was a terrorist on every plane, right? So that's really where we focused. And then as, in the years directly preceding 9/11, as we moved forward, our focus turned not away from terrorism, but terrorism and then becoming law enforcement officers on an aircraft and certainly looking towards other violations on the airplane. And of course, we went from Al-Qaeda to ISIS and then a number of other groups that we were focused on. And then shortly thereafter, it became IEDs on an aircraft for the longest time. And that's kind of where our focus went as went forward. And then, intermingled in there are the traditional nation states and the threat they pose to aviation security. And then, of course, COVID and January 6th, and our attention turned towards domestic terrorism. And here recently, there's been a little bit of focus on non-terrorism events, particularly disturbances on aircraft, which I'm sure everyone here can appreciate. Those certainly went up during COVID and during mask mandates and so on, and they really have not subsided to this point. So, and then all of that sort of comes together for us into a growing area of concern, and that's insider threat. And so as you look out and you think whether we're talking about nation states or terrorism cells or domestic terrorism or just criminal activity, much of our aviation security, whether it's quantity or quality, the layers of security have gotten so much better that it's been made pretty clear to us that insider threat now becomes something that we certainly have to focus on, certainly where we need the attention of those in this room as we look into those from within that might represent a vulnerability for us.
Absolutely. We're glad you're shifting just as the adversaries are. Jason, how's your change in focus and where you work?
Yeah, I'd say airport law enforcement over the last 30 years, long time, 27 and a half. We've gone on the journey with the creation of TSA and the focus on obviously any violent event, whether it's terrorist related or not, supporting TSA and the whole security mission and the airlines and their security mission is still an important part of airport policing. There's kind of three things for airport policing, which is the traditional law enforcement stuff, security, interface with TSA and the federal regulations. We are a regulated entity, just like the airlines are, just like all of you are. So it's a challenge, but a very positive one in working with TSA as an operational partner and stakeholder, and also a regulator. And I would say the third part, which has been the biggest change over the last 5 to 6 years, is local and regional external impacts to the aviation environment, meaning the crime trends kind of stopped at the airport a few years back, and we had our own unique set of issues where all of you may be experiencing what I've been experiencing, which is where those car theft rings don't stop at the airport and just work in the bad neighborhoods anymore. Assaults, mental health issues, obviously addiction and homelessness has really impacted, I know, airports across the country. So it's been the challenge to support, especially air carriers, as they're seeing the impact of that on their workforce in different regions, and I know you all have, and then maintain our overall high-level security interface with the federal agencies and the regulated entities. So yeah, it's been a challenging 5 to 6 years, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. We just have to be a little more nimble and adapt as things evolve.
Great, yeah, that is important. Dan, and your experience there in the evolution, how have you seen your mission change?
Sure. So I appreciate you mentioning the local crime threat. When we talk about threats to aviation, it's easy to jump right to the terrorism threat, especially today on the anniversary of 9/11. So 23 years ago, the FBI, came to airports in a very different way than they had been in the past. And to this day, we remain laser focused on the terrorism threat. Luckily, every day there aren't terrorist threats at the airport, so I find myself with some time to address the other threats. And a lot of those are criminal in nature. So make no mistake, the traditional, if you want to phrase it that way, CT threat is still there. The effort's still there. The funding is still there. The intent is still there. All the signs are there. It is evolving. We are evolving with it. And it is less linear than I remember it when I started my career. 20 years ago, they handed me a top secret SCI Q clearance, and it was eye-opening to see the threat intelligence. And now when I read the intel reports, it's more like a spider web than I remember it being a little more straightforward in the past. The threats we see today on the terrorism front are commingled, a little more confusing, and luckily we have excellent intelligence analysts that have also evolved with the threat, and they can distill it down for us and tell us where we need to protect at any given moment. But in addition to that, it can spread to things that aren't traditionally thought of as counterterrorism threats. For example, you mentioned the insider threat. So insiders are one thing that would keep me up at night. If you asked me, okay, you're the FBI, you've been working in an airport for 5+ years, where's our blind spot? Well, the tricky stuff is the insider, because they're supposed to be trusted. And, I can envision a scenario where, airports are small cities, and there's crime going on there. I can envision a scenario where someone is putting something through security, maybe it's drugs. They get used to it, they get complacent. They would never do something in a terrorist setting, but one day what they think is in the package isn't what they thought drugs were in the package. So that would be an unwitting insider threat. The access is there and it can be capitalized on. And that's sort of that tweak on the complexity and the evolution of these threats. So when we talk about insiders, we have to remember not all are the traditional terrorists. They could just be someone lazy or trying to earn a buck, and they could have terrible ramifications. The tools we have to combat that ebb and flow. So after 9/11, the authority that the FBI had was different than it is today. And that's great. We, the people, decide how much authority we should have at any given time. And the pendulum can swing. Of course, being an investigator, you always want more access, right? You always want everyone's phone number. You always want everyone's email, and you want to run it across the database. And we respect the laws as they are, and we do the best we can with the accesses we're given to protect the privacy of the people at the airport, our potential insider threats, and couple that with what we know from the hard work we do over the horizon. And if we can use the intel analysts and the threat picture that we form and the laws as they are and pull that data together and float to the top, something of interest to us, that's where we earn our paycheck. And that's what we try and do every day.
That's great. Having heard some of what of the work that has been done by the FBI, it's clear that you're kind of staying ahead of some of the trends and good data analysis, one of those ways. So we're certainly happy to hear you do that. Darren, you have a unique perspective as having access and working with our government partners. So on behalf of the Airline Pilots Association, what's your perspective on the current threat environment?
From my personal perspective, I'd say it's the highest threat I've seen since 9/11. I think there's state actors, there's organizations, there's groups, there's individuals that still see aviation as the crown jewel. If they can take down an airplane or if they can target the ecosystem in some way, that it will have this tremendous effect on travel, our economy, and everything along those lines. I think our current threat matrix, we talked already, insider threat, disruptive passenger in-flight crimes. I think we're getting a foothold on that. We know what direction we want to go. We know what we're looking for. I think CISA has done a pretty good job looking at our cyber piece. Now we're looking at the avionics piece. I think we're going to get a grasp on that. The techniques, UAS, UAV that we're seeing in Ukraine with Russia, those are almost frightening in some regards. But I think the FBI and the Air Marshal Service is going to get a grasp on that once we get the legislative body behind it. But what really I look at, and I think we're way behind on, is the radiological, chemical, and biological piece. The weaponization of fentanyl or carfentanil, how little of that is required to incapacitate or kill. And it's on the radar, but just the first blip. And we need to get hold of that really fast. So from my viewpoint, like Dan said, the threats are more of a spider web now. They're not defined like, hey, we're going after ISIS or Al-Qaeda or something. We have a lot of enemies in the world, and we need to always be aware of what's going on.
Yeah, it's clear that the threat environment is very dynamic. Our adversaries are certainly starting to exploit any holes they can find, and so we've definitely seen there's not only a need to shift, but a need to start thinking ahead of what will be the next threat. And particularly with ALPA, since you're tied in with all of that, what do you think as far as strengthening the aviation ecosystem? What's ALPA's role there, and what route do we take to do our part?
I think ALPA's role is to ensure that we have one level of safety. I think that's our mantra, right? One level of safety, but sometimes we forget the security piece. We can really focus on passenger safety and we forget about our cargo brethren. We're all cargo pilots, right? We're hauling stuff down in the cargo bays, right? So we need to always keep that in mind, but ALPA's approach is the entire ecosystem. We go from the cockpit to Congress. And I try to view things as a line pilot. I consider myself a realist and sometimes somebody that should probably pull back a little bit on the truth, but it needs to be out there. And so from our line pilot that walks up to get to work, what's his first thing he hits? KCM. We work on KCM every day. We continue to work on it. We look at enhanced crew access and collaborate with TSA to how to make that user-friendly. We get to the airplane, we walk through the IRCD, right? And then we sit down, and soon we're going to have secondary barriers, but our cargo pilots have neither. And they have more than 70% of the wide-body fleet, so how can we miss that? How can Congress miss that? Hey, I sit down, I punch in everything I need on my FMC. I've got cyber and my nav facilities, right? So ALPA's involved in that, and we need to be aware of that. Door closes, off I go. Our FFDO's admission status, so we're involved in that from before the program even stood up. We were an advocate for it, and we are a big proponent of it now. I can go on and on. We look at our legislative affairs team. We're involved from introducing bills, supporting bills, working on the budget, talking to our legislators, doing a great job there. We're on the ASAC committee, where we're actually giving guidance to the administrator, the TSA. So, we're basically a cockpit to Congress, but it takes a lot of effort, and ALPA does a pretty good job on it. We got to stay on it because it's been a long time since 9/11.
I absolutely agree, and it's really been good as an ALPA pilot seeing not only as we've had these engagements, because they haven't all been wins. Just be honest. There's been some certain times where we weren't sure what the future of some of these programs were, but I'd say it's hard to dismiss the work that ALPA's done in that regard, because it's starting to trend in the right direction, and we're very glad to hear that. And same with TSA and all the other organizations. And John, with the Federal Air Marshals, there's been some recent changes with the future of the FAMs and how that mission is evolved. Can you talk about that a little bit and where it's headed?
Yeah, we're in the middle of what would probably inarguably be called the largest transformation of the agency since 9/11, since we expanded right after 9/11. So our mission has always been and still continues to be, when you get right down to it, it's about theoretical risk mitigation within the transportation domain. If you apply that specifically to aviation and the airlines, for years, primarily, almost exclusively, what we did was fly on aircraft. And so in theory, you reduce risk to that aircraft. So, but as we've gone along, and of course the other layers of aviation security have gotten better and better, combined with an awareness that our workforce comes to these positions with a lot of great experience, whether it's law enforcement or transportation security, certainly highly educated, and of course our training is very good. And so there's been a realization that we can mitigate risk outside the aircraft even better than we do inside the aircraft at a macro level. So it doesn't mean that in-flight security is not our primary and certainly our most important effort, but our air marshals, our federal air marshals, or FAMs, are now mitigating risk outside the aircraft as well. So we're talking about anything from being on an increased presence on task force, like the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, increased presence within the airports, whether it's uniformed and non-uniformed patrols. We have insider threat inquiries, we have vulnerability assessments, UAS activities, just a number of different things now that we're delving into and putting our air marshals into. But of course, we remain nimble the whole time. So if there's an increased threat, if it's appropriate for us to rotate more back to the aircraft, certainly we'll do that. But in the meantime, this is what we're evolving to.
No, and it's great because I think it's indicative that maybe the efforts have brought enough emphasis on aviation that the bad guys have to look for other avenues. So perhaps that's a good thing, and by being able to focus in the directions you're going, it's going to hopefully lead to more protections. Dan, with the FBI, can you tell us about some of the work that you've taken on in that regard?
Sure. Just to piggyback a little bit, everything we've done around the airport in recent memory has really tried to harden the target and make it unattractive. So maybe they do get pushed elsewhere. But boy, we're not perfect. If you work in and around an airport, you can see some of the security theater, some of the efforts, and when you run red teams, you can see some vulnerabilities. And we do our best to plug those gaps. But it's an entire US government, and then even reaching out to our foreign partners, effort to figure out if the threat's coming to us, because if it comes to us, do we trust that all that things are in place at the airport to stop it? I mean, I don't want to be put to that test. I want to reach out and figure out where the threat's coming from and do the best we can to prevent it from happening in the first place. Where the FBI really shines, in my view, is our Joint Terrorism Task Force. So I mentioned earlier we have 11 federal agents in my office in Washington, D.C. that cover Reagan and Dulles. So those 11 people include Federal Air Marshal, Customs and Border Protection officer, and a local police officer. So that team, without those 3 task force officers, we would be largely blind at the airport. Where we see the biggest bang for our bucks is when we are working things that help on the fringes of our counterterrorism mission. So if it's a stolen rental car that we normally would not care about, eventually that can evolve into something getting smuggled overseas with bad things hidden in the trunk, ending up in hands of someone we do care about. And all of a sudden that ends up on my doorstep, and I'm talking to the manager of Hertz right down the road from the airport. When we're working with Border Patrol or Border Protection, and someone comes across the passport lane, and we see on their phone that there's child abuse material on their phone. where that pivots to and where we can parlay that into other CT investigations. It's all these things on the fringe that help us untangle the spider web where we're really earning big leaps and bounds in intelligence gathering and figuring out the who's who that we need to know about. So similarly, outside of our task force officers in our office, we try and maintain great relationships with our foreign partners. We have people come over and visit us. Just a few months ago, another country came over and sat with us at Reagan Airport and picked our brains, and we picked their brains, and we compared notes. So we can't do this alone, and it's the relationships we build. I know it sounds a little cliche, but it is truly the relationships we build at the airport through all the other stuff that we do that really inform our counterterrorism posture and threat picture. Because whether it's UAS or whether it's terrorist cells infiltrating cities in and around us, they tend to gravitate to criminal behavior, we're noticing. And if we can get inroads anywhere we can, that's where we're going to take them, and we're going to build up from there. So staying plugged in with all the stakeholders at the airport, having air marshals in and around us at the airport, helping us is great. They punch above their weight, and they have saved us from manpower issue on more than one occasion at Dulles Airport. So we understand it's a transition for them, but we're reaping some of the rewards. So thanks.
No, and it's appropriate considering that today being the 23rd anniversary of 9/11, some of the failures that occurred from not having interagency cooperation, that has now evolved to this point now, and it's something worth highlighting that interagency work is key throughout every facet of the airport, and obviously TSA is another piece of that puzzle. So how does FBI interact and work? Do you have a good interagency working relationship in that regard?
We do. We sit just feet apart from our task force officers. If you walked in our office, you wouldn't really know who's FBI, who's CBP, who's TSA. We all kind of just have the one team, one fight mentality. And I don't want to paint just the rosiest picture ever. Yes, we have policy disagreements, and we don't always see eye to eye with lawyers because we're threat focused and we're mission focused. And when we see a threat, we want to do everything in our power to mitigate it. So when it comes to international travel, we're pretty well positioned with Customs and Border Protection to have visibility into who's flying where and some good authorities on what we can do as they come over the border. It's invaluable to us. Domestically, we're a bit limited on what we can see. TSA, just like we have an air marshal in my office, we have FBI agents detailed to TSA. And we just cross-pollinate, and when it comes to a very, very serious terrorist threat, yes, there's a solution for us to see if a U.S. person is traveling from a U.S. city to a U.S. city. The secure flight system allows that visibility when appropriate and when legal. When you remove the counterterrorism threat from it, and it's just a criminal case, or for example, if we have intelligence that someone is traveling to San Francisco, and all we know is that they're traveling back to the DC area, which could be Reagan, Dulles, BWI, and they're bringing a 12-year-old girl back to do terrible things to her, probably for the rest of her life. It'd be great to just pop that secure flight system open and see what flight that person's on. There's some legal hurdles we have to jump through when you remove the counterterrorism statement from the case. Now, we're very good at being creative and working around systems and making sure, because try and stop me, we're going to be at the right baggage carousel. I'm going to get the information one way or another. But how hard is it? How long does it take? How much do we value privacy protection versus my ability to just look in a secure flight system and see when a U.S. person's traveling in their own country These are battles, and that's the pendulum I mentioned and the sway. But it's those relationship we build when you can just call someone and say, hey, it's Dan. When you call and you say the FBI has a request, it's like, well, does that request fit the policy? When you call someone and say, hey, it's Dan, I've got a situation, they know me, they know I'm not trying to abuse systems, we can get where we need to get to usually, but it's tricky. And those hurdles exist, and we do the best we can despite lawyers.
And that's great.
It's FBI. It's FBI.
Love lawyers.
Good job, Dan.
Well, and I mean, where a silo mentality existed before, it's great to hear that that's not the barrier that maybe holds you up. So
Not anymore.
yeah, that's great. And Jason, I mean, you've been an industry aviation leader for many years, and up there as chief of police in Portland, and is the president of Aviation. So when it comes to initiatives that law enforcement officers are taking to improve quality of security in aviation, be interested to hear your take.
Well, let's start at the baseline, right? So every place is different. You've all experienced it in your travels, in your workplace. Every jurisdiction is different. Every airport's different. We talked a little bit about that with the jump seat group. But we all start with the regulations, which require a certain level of response in support of you at the gate or in your workplace, and also to the TSA screening operations. And that's the baseline. And then it all goes out from there. And I think one thing Dan mentioned has been an important philosophy for me, and I've seen some of the more successful state, local agencies employ, and that's a defense in depth philosophy in your operational deployment. So in referencing non-terrorist criminal behavior that actually opens the door or mirrors patterns of terrorist activity, Dan's right. I mean, this happens all the time. And when you start separating it out at your area, well, we're not going to investigate this kind of crime or this kind of activity for whatever political reason, you are cutting off the potential to prevent other crimes that have the exact same behavior. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail there, but you have to be holistic and very thorough in your operational deployment and your focus. And so for us, that has been engaged in multiple task forces throughout the region. And it took a while for me to convince our airport leadership the benefit of that, but you know, to just what Dan was saying, when you have a detective on the Joint Terrorism Task Force or a major crimes team or a human trafficking team, they gain that experience, and really is a synergy effect there. And you then discover all the things that are happening at your airport that you didn't realize were going on, and you can harden the processes and work within the regulations to prevent all those things from happening. What was the original part of your question, Steve?
I think it was primarily just that your initiatives
Yeah.
and what you've done. I mean, Portland, a lot of people don't know that Portland has really kind of been an innovator in a lot of these ways doing.
I like Steve's positive spin. I thought he was going to go a challenging environment, but he said an innovator. So
Well, getting the
thank you,
budget,
Steve.
getting budget is a
Yeah.
huge challenge, and when you do that, it certainly is something people take notice
So
of.
one of the things we've done is, and I tell it to my team all the time, you're going to have risk, you're going to have budget issues. We all have it. Okay? There's always risk. You're never going to mitigate or eliminate all risk. So what's an acceptable level of risk? And within your budget, how can you get creative? And how can you modify things for the most impact? For instance, where do all you flight crews stay when you're traveling? Hotels, right? Raise your hand if you've ever stayed at a hotel for your job. Go ahead, raise. Everybody has. Who drives themselves to the airport, or who takes a shuttle?
Both.
Everybody takes a shuttle for the most part, right? And for the most part, aren't we all usually together when we're on the shuttle or in, okay, that's always been a huge weakness or a huge thing that I've been concerned about for 30 years. And usually, I forget about it because I got a lot going on. But then when we have a traffic crash or a traffic jam that prevents the flight crew from getting there, I remind myself, oh yeah, this was an initiative I was going to pick up. The shuttle drivers themselves have a lot of intel on suspicious actors that stay in the hotels. You all interact with them. It's also an area, in my opinion, that flight crews are vulnerable. Nothing to do with airport screening, nothing to do with pre-flight checks, nothing to do with anything that has to do with the aviation environment. So it's really looking at the problem, whatever that is, and going out and seeing where the most vulnerabilities are. And then just to close that out, one thing I always tell our folks is, you've all seen police at different airports at the checkpoint, correct? We've all seen them. So obviously there's federal regulations that require a certain level of response. And we've tried very hard at the national level to work with TSA on keeping those as a flexible, a hybrid option as opposed to fixed. Some airports opt into fixed, or they lose their negotiation with TSA for fixed post. And just for me philosophically, in just reinforcing the defense in depth or getting creative and having more bang for the deployment buck, just to give you an example. If I deploy an officer with a pistol or a long gun at a checkpoint, and there's a bad actor who is intent on engaging an unarmed crowd or engaging and doing damage with folks, and I deploy my resource at the checkpoint, I guarantee I know where the shots will be fired. They're going to be fired at the checkpoint, okay? So these are my arguments I have with all my folks that I deal with, and I think I've been able to convince some folks that we need to modify. And that doesn't mean that we don't deploy things in the areas that you need to be visible, but I can tell you this, the hardest place to prevent a jewelry theft is sticking a security guard right by the most high-end jewelry counter in the jewelry store. Smash the jewelry, take it away and run out. Yeah, you'd much rather develop a case, arrest the jewelry thief in their apartment with their buddies as they're planning the big heist. So I look at terrorism and other violent crimes the same way. We have to be engaged with our partners, whether federal, state, or local, and doing the work that then gets you in the door to prevent those other crimes.
That's great, and I think the challenge that we, especially in the aviation ecosystem, like we keep kind of talking about, is just this ebb and flow of where we have to deploy resources. And of course, there's jurisdictional overlap, and I'm sure Dan and John, you probably have to deal with a little of that in your area of work. Do you see that being a challenge?
I don't see it too much anymore. What was more of a challenge is familiarizing people with why the FBI is involved with people getting punched in the face on airplanes. The jurisdiction issue with the FBI is once that door shuts on an airplane, our jurisdiction starts. So if you're in a metal tube at altitude, flying over county lines, city lines, different states, of course, jurisdiction would be a nightmare. It's just magically FBI jurisdiction. So it's sort of clean in that sense that if something happens in flight, we're the only ones who can prosecute that situation. Now, I think when the FBI was built, it was not really built with an eye towards someone getting punched in the face on an airplane. We're designed to do very complex enterprise cases with counterterrorism, espionage, violent criminal gangs, international things. So convincing United States attorneys who are working these major cases to focus on a simple assault, which is a legal term, it's nothing simple about it, but a simple assault on an aircraft, which had it happened on a city bus, would be handled by the local police department. But because it's happening in flight, it's a United States of America versus subject, and you're appearing before a federal judge because you punched someone, you assaulted them. So it took some education, and it still takes some education because different jurisdictions have different lawyers at different education experience levels. And we have worked really hard in the Eastern District of Virginia, and I know a lot of other airports have as well. We hosted attorneys out to the airport, and they get it now. And we're slapping cuffs on people, taking them right to jail on the spot more than we have in the past. And the head of the DOJ even put a memo out maybe a year ago now, and this was at the height of the COVID mask incident, saying that the United States Attorney's Office should focus more on this matter. And I have seen, at least in our jurisdiction, much warmer reception to working these cases and taking some to trial, and we do our best. We don't always win because we don't have, we have what we have when that plane lands. We have the witnesses we have. But we will do our best, and we'll risk it, and we'll go to trial, and we've had a lot of success lately. So jurisdiction, we're okay in that in that realm right now.
That's been a great evolution because obviously
Yeah.
nobody that's had somebody be a bad actor on an airplane wants to hear that they walked away scot-free. And you know, that's been something that we're appreciative of in this district in particular. Darren, we were just talking about what Jason did with budget, and you've been kind of instrumental in the FFDO side on budgeting, and I'd like to hear a little bit about what your thoughts are on that effort, being that the FFDO program is such a low-cost operation. What are your thoughts on the efficiency of the program and the direction it needs to go?
I think the efficiency speaks for itself. If you don't know, the program's been in existence for just over 20 years. 23 million missions, and that's where an armed pilot has been at the controls of an airplane. So more than 1 million missions a year, and the average cost per mission is around $25. Congress called the FFDO program the most efficient security program in the U.S. government. So, I mean, it speaks for itself in that regards. But we have continued to have budget challenges. We always, it's supported by, it's a bipartisan support. So House, Senate, Republican, Democrat, everybody likes the program. So it's an easy one to take the money away from, and then they know that we will become engaged to get that money back. So COVID was very detrimental to it with the shutdown of the federal law enforcement training centers. We are still down percentage-wise from our height. We're getting back there. I am sure the federal government is going to shut down. I'm willing to bet a paycheck if anybody wants to come see me afterwards. But once that's all settled out, they're saying that we'll have the largest budget we've ever had in history. So that's a direct result of our constituents here at ALPA, you know, reaching out to our legislative affairs team, super successful getting that done. And I like to think the results speak for themselves, you know.
Absolutely, and like we've already heard, it's a theme, right? Building relationships, and you know, ALPA in particular, we started swimming in some pools we used to not, and you know, I use Jason as the example with ALEAN, the Airport Law Enforcement Agency Network, because our partnership in there has kind of gone both ways on not only education but collaboration. And a perfect example, there's a monthly ALEAN call, and I get to participate in that. And you know, it wasn't long after that, you know, the investigations unit in Fort Myers had somebody running cash on one of our airplanes, and I get a call, hey, we've got a PNR on the bad guy, but we don't know who the other person is. Can you help us out? And it's simply a relationship with corporate security to get that information to the investigator so that when bad guy gets from point A to point B, they're ready to pick up and continue their work. And so that's something that obviously we can attest to as being valuable. Jason, I know I'm preaching to the choir with you. I mean, what do you think? You, John, do you see some benefits in that regard?
From the relationship perspective? Yeah. You know, I mentioned the transformation that the Air Marshal Service is going through. It's absolutely imperative for us that we build and strengthen our relationships with all the private and public stakeholders as we push forward with these new endeavors. So I'm a firm believer that if you build relationships of trust with people, you get extended grace. That's how it kind of works, right? And as we work through this stuff, you know, for so long we were almost primarily on airplanes. And it's funny to hear Dan talk about the aircraft, because that's what we used to tell our air marshals, right? As soon as that door shuts, it's your aircraft. But we are the law enforcement element, or the primary law enforcement element for TSA and all of transportation. And so we do have overlapping jurisdiction, not just with the FBI, but with a number of law enforcement agencies. So as we push forward and figure out exactly what we can do, work through that lawyer problem that Dan mentioned, and then not only what we can do, but what we want to do, what we're funded to do, where the gaps are, whether it's local law enforcement or the FBI, and then figure out how to do that without stepping on each other's toes. It's gonna be a feeling out process, and we're gonna have missteps, and those relationships are just gonna be key as we figure this out.
Sure, and that obviously presents not only, you know, opportunity for growth, but opportunity to improve relationships, improve how we view the ecosystem of aviation and the city, as Dan described it, whether it's at the airport or the bigger view of the organization. So, it's hard to predict, where we're going to be in the long term. It's almost scary to think of in a way, but have you identified any areas where there's an opportunity to perhaps improve, to build a more secure aviation ecosystem? What do you think, Dan?
There's a lot of area and room for improvement always. And as Jason mentioned earlier, that local crime picture is where we're making great strides right now. Being hyper-focused on the traditional CT threat was and still is warranted, but it's too simple to say the threat has evolved. And yes, we're evolving with it, but it's happening so fast, and it's happening on top of that spider web that I mentioned, that it's pivoting into an area where we can get hit outside traditional ways. We are involved in some awful situations overseas right now. There's some wars going on in the world. There's a lot of people that have ill will towards the United States, and nothing will stop them from trying to execute their evil on us. And for a long time, there have been some faded rules, some faded lines in the road where you traditionally see these threats come in. And lately, those lanes have been fading, and we're seeing areas attacked that are less traditional and in less traditional ways. So if people are looking to do harm towards us, it might not look like a terrorist. It might not look like a missile. It might not even look like a drone attack, which would be relatively new today. It could be something far more simple, and whether we attribute it to the true source or whether they just co-opted a criminal to do harm and cause us to be further divided as a country, that's the complexity we're up against. And how to combat that is even more complex. And when we try and punch back, we're sort of damned if we do and damned if we don't in some ways. But that's where I see the room to grow. And the path forward is still a little murky, but we're recruiting the right people, and we recognize it, and we won't stop until we do everything we can to protect against it.
Yeah, and that's the one thing that us as security professionals, we all share the passion for not having a repeat of what happened 23 years ago. And I'm sure TSA has seen some opportunities as well to grow. Got anything that you could think of right there that similar to in what Dan's saying?
Yeah, as we look forward for us, the biggest one of our big challenges right now is hiring and attrition, and certainly all federal government agencies are fighting budget woes right now. Our budget is a fraction of what it was at its height, specifically for the Air Marshal Service, not necessarily TSA. And so when you look at us going forward and how we evolve, it's going to be about being more nimble, doing more with less. Certainly less from a personnel perspective, from operating budgets and so on. So, federal law enforcement retirements are generally, 20 years at age 50. Here we are at, so 20, the agency expanded out after 9/11. So around 2022, what happened? We get a mass exodus of folks. And that's still occurring, and so replenishing our ranks in a time when hiring into law enforcement agencies is a challenge for everybody, it's tough for us. So we certainly are looking every day to figure out what we can do with less.
Sure, and attrition can be an opportunity to bring in new blood and reinvigorate the program. So these are certainly things that we see on the aviation side, because we have the age 65 attrition that is occurring, and we mentor and we do things to help advance the initiatives that we have, because there's a multitude, of course, and I'm sure Jason could probably speak to that, being that he's kind of an OG over there in Portland, right?
Is this an age thing? I don't know. I'm feeling a little attacked right now, Steve. No, you know, it's a challenge for everybody, and every time I start to complain, I realize every industry was affected by, we all had a COVID budget emergency, then we had a COVID hiring emergency, and I will say those are usually cyclical, right? We had one in 2008, 2018, whatever the budget is at the time. The only difference is this is really accelerated, right? It just seemed to all happen within a year. And so, yeah, we're right there along with all of you, where we had to cut our budget, and then we almost instantaneously didn't have enough people. And so we're all struggling the same. I will say, I don't want to get too much into the generational thing or the challenge of a new workforce, but it is going to be an issue. I'll do a broad statement. It will be an issue. And I don't really have my head around a solution. But you know, the cool thing about COVID is, man, I can use Teams and I can use all those cool virtual tools that we've had for a long time that we never really used. And then now I see a kind of a push for all of us to maybe justify our expenditures on the leases that we're paying on our buildings, but to make people come back. And I have whole groups of employees that I would love to have to keep remote, but we're forcing them back in. And I get both sides of that. So I see that being a challenge with the new workforce. You know, I'm trying to hire a new business analyst, a little higher level than just a crime analyst. We have tons of data like all of you, and I just want a better handle on what the real picture is. I don't need that person in the office. And actually, I'm running out of space, but I can't do remote anymore. So there are going to be a lot of workforce challenges that will continue. Absolutely.
No, and again, it's an opportunity to grow, and I hope that everyone that has heard this understands that there's a lot of work going on your behalf, especially with security. We brought a great sample of what that looks like, and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you very much for coming to tell everyone about it. Thank you.
Thank you.